Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending our April 22nd Improving Talk. We are thrilled you're spending some of your Friday with us. Before we start, I want to inform you about a feature in the presentation that will make the session more interactive. Please make note of the question mark icon at the upper right of the presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the question and answer feature, which allows you to send the moderator questions to be delivered to our insightful presenters at the appropriate time. Speaking of insightful presenters, I am proud to present Devlin Lyles, who is president at Improving's Houston office, an author and someone I feel blessed to call my friend. Devlin is presenting with another one of my great friends, Claudio Lasala. Claudio is a technical director at Improving as well as an avid fan of motorcycle racing and making music. Today, Devlin and Claudio will be sharing an interactive discussion titled The Business Case for Testing. The floor is all yours, gentlemen.
Thank you, Sherman. And Claudia, thanks for sitting down and having this conversation.
My pleasure, absolutely.
So I know you very well. We've known each other for a lot of years now, but how about you introduce yourself to everybody out there?
Sure thing. Well, I hail all the way from Sao Paulo, Brazil, being in the US for about 20 years now. Been doing software since the mid-90s, as far as I remember, all the way back to like Clipper, DBase days, going through all levels of .NET, Ruby on Rails, all that kind of fun stuff. Back in 2004-ish, 2003, I started learning and developing a passion for testing, automated testing in general, and incorporating that into my work as a developer. And I do feel like it's my mission to be the glue between technical and non-technical folks. So like breaking down technical jargons to the business folks and also learning some of the business and relay that back to the technical guys. That it seems to resonate well with me and with the people with whom I interact.
That's fantastic. And a little bit about me. If you're coming back to the second of these talks, you heard this a little bit earlier, but so I'm Devlin Lyles. I started deeply technical and then transitioned later in my career into business leadership, sales, and leading people. And one of the things that I found interesting, and is the reason for this series of talks, is that oftentimes we'll have conversations that we're uniquely suited to be able to navigate because of a passion to hold non-technical or technical together, or my passion for business matched with a technical background. And so we wanted to kind of open the fourth wall and bring everybody into those conversations to give you some tools, some techniques, and maybe even a little bit that will help you get through that next conversation you have to have. And so with that, we're going to be continuing this series, and they're going to be a business case for something deeply technical, whether that was CQRS with Tim Rayburn last time, or testing with Claudio, or coming up next month, we're going to be diving into domain-driven design with Dave Reynes out of our Minneapolis office, and really kind of trying to understand what the purpose of these are in business terms, and understanding the costs and why we would want to engage there to solve a business problem. We're going to viciously get rid of jargon and acronyms. And so I'm going to ask Claudio, if I use a piece of business jargon or acronym, call me out on it. I'll do the same for you.
Yeah.
And we're trying to look beyond the typical technical conversation of why these things have value and dig into the roots of where they make a difference, either in revenue or in profit, speed to market, employee retention, kind of the big measures of business success. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our scenario. We are internally to Improving right now, going through some internal development of applications. And one of those is combining the internal operational platform, trying to tie our CRM systems and our accounting systems and our employee engagement and growth systems all together. And it's super complex. And one of the recommendations that's been made is that testing should be an integral part of that, from the very beginning of design through implementation and maintenance of the system. And so I want to start with kind of the baseline question. We have testing after the application as kind of a standard in the industry. If we want to take the approach of bringing it into design, into implementation, my initial question is, why is testing before it goes to production not enough? Why does that fall short?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the way we've been approaching this as an industry in the past, when we have testing done by oftentimes a separate team, separate people who are not involved in the creation, the conception of the system, the testing is done based on what's being implemented, and there is a detachment from why is it implemented. So oftentimes testers will be testing what got created, just making sure that, hey, this hammer works. But then when the tool is introduced to the end user, they have a screw. It's like, well, okay, the hammer works well for that scenario, but for the thing that I'm using. So having this detachment between what gets created and the purpose that it's supposed to serve, that's a bad thing, right? It incurs costs when you have to come back into the implementation and say, yeah, when we put that in front of the actual end users, the actual stakeholders, it's not anywhere near close to what they actually need this to do.
That's a fantastic point. And something I want to touch on here is there's a very subtle point that Claudio just made in which it's catching a translation issue, right? Because oftentimes I, as a business person without a technical background, don't know what level of detail I need to communicate. And so if I say I've got two pieces of board and I need to attach them in such a way that it's secure, that it can hold X amount of weight, a nail might be the right way to do that. And if I describe that problem, I go, and we've got these fasteners and I need something to make sure they go all the way in. A hammer might solve that problem, but the translation issue of, oh yeah, and it can't vibrate its way back out, or those kind of things might differentiate between using a nail and using a screw. But I'm not typically going to know that without somebody asking me a lot more detailed questions that are pertinent. I may not volunteer important details because to me, they're not important. They're understood. Everybody gets it. And so that translation piece of the conversation, I think, is really where you highlighted that testing as a discipline, maybe not as a activity, makes a big difference.
Correct. Yeah, and another example that I normally give people is it's very easy to say, hey, here's what the requirement says. I need something where I'm going to punch in two numbers, and then when I hit this add button, it gives me the result. Oh yeah, hold my beer. That's easy to do. But then if people don't take the time to ask, what is the meaning of those numbers? You may lose the fact that, oh, we're adding currencies. So we have US dollar being added to Mexican pesos, right? And then the output, I would like to have it in, pounds or what have you. So you need to know what those things are, and just looking at the face value, oh, are we adding up two numbers properly? Well, tell me more about it. What do those numbers actually mean?
Absolutely. And so I hear often tons of terminology around this. So you hear unit testing or white box or black box or production or beta testing or smoke testing. Like there's dozens of answers or types that I keep hearing about. So if we start with like the basics, what are those used for and why? Do they all play into the scenario you just mentioned?
Not all of them. So you have different types of tests for the different intents, right? So when people first start getting used to, say, automated testing. So let's start from the manual testing, right? There are situations where folks are going to say, oh, now we've gone fully automated. We only run automated tests. Okay, is your application a business application meant to be used by real people, like humans? If that's the case, you cannot automate everything, because at the end of the day, there's going to be humans using that application. So you do want to have manual testing, right? Human people understanding the problems that we're trying to solve, and then using the software to solve those problems. So that's one type. And then other types would be fluctuate from unit testing, which is a very granular, small test meant to be easy to write, fast to execute, so that you can write like thousands of them and they're going to run within a second, right? And then cover one aspect, one fraction of the overall system. And then you may need to go into bigger levels of tests, like integration testing, where you have to integrate not just small bits of what you're producing, but bigger bits of what you're producing. And also, as importantly, integrating with other people's systems, right? Because if you have an e-commerce kind of solution that integrates with like a credit card processing service, you want to make sure that you test those integration points. And the main cost factor, I guess, decision between, okay, which one should we choose over those? It depends on, of course, cost and the value that we get out of it. Think of a car, right? When you build a car, eventually you do have to test that car to see how it crashes, right? Because people in the real life, they will crash their cars. And if you don't test for that, you're going to get, yourself, in troubles like troubles and things like that. Now, testing a car for a crash test, I think we've all watched on TV, right? You have to like rig up the car with a dummy in there. You don't want to test it with a human being in there. And then you want to capture that on slow-mo camera to see how everything works. That's very necessary test, but very expensive to set it up and run, but you still want to do it. Mm-hmm. Right? So then it comes from like the technologist to explain to the business, what are the levels of tests, the kinds of tests, what kind of overhead do we have to pull them off, right? What kind of value do they yield to the overall process? And then for the business to decide, based on the budget that we have, the overall cost, and then pick and choose which one we should be using.
It's interesting. I'd never considered the corollary between testing and products, right? Because if I'm selling high volume products, right, I'm going to be kind of trying to get as many of them as possible through, and I'm going to be aiming for efficiency. I'm going to be trying to go as fast as I can, as low cost as I can. That sounds a lot like unit testing, right? Where it's about the volume, it's about covering the spread with a lot of little pieces.
Yes.
Whereas high margin products, where I might only make 10, 12, 15 sales a year, but I'm going to make sure that I optimize each of those sales to produce the maximum amount of value for both me and my customer. Because I'm not going to have a ton of them, I've got to make sure I pick the right ones, I craft the sale correctly. That sounds a lot more like that business case testing that you were talking about, those expensive tests.
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so as we go through this, like costing, time, budget for testing becomes a big part of the conversation.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Interesting. And so if I look at it and I go, I don't have the time to budget for those expensive tests, is that okay?
It may or may not be, right? The problem is, and that's a conversation that always comes up as far as maybe developers will tell the business, hey, it's going to take us an extra 6 hours to work on this feature because we need to write tests. The business may come back and say, well, we don't have time for that, or we don't have that as part of the budget. But we have to look through the whole thing, because there's something I've learned a long time ago, which is this notion that the farthest a bug or a code makes from the developer's machine, the more expensive it gets to change or fix. Right, so at the time that it's being written, produced, that's the proper time to identify, rooms for errors and things like that. The farther it makes out of the developer's machine, if we put something out in the wild in production, it will take time, money, and effort to identify what the source of the problem is, right? Make the proper correction, and then send it back with a fix for the customers, right? Because usually when customers and users, they call up your customer support, right, which is cost, there's cost involved with that. The customer will say, yeah, your product or service is not great. Oh, what's not so great about it? Oh, it doesn't work, right? You don't have enough information to actually, dive into the problem and address the problem. Mm-hmm. So that's where the kind of decision point comes in as to, do we want to pay that price now or later, right? So there are times when it's like, yes, right now we don't have the time to make a comprehensive suite of tests, but let's at least put like the minimal, like the smokes type of test that we say, we run through it. If it throws smoke, okay, halt the process, don't move forward. Put that in the market if, time to market is the primary value that we're chasing after. And then as we come back, we expand on that.
That makes sense. It's interesting you compare the cost of writing the test to that maybe cost of production bugs.
Right.
And now we could talk all day about whether it's a 10% risk or a 90% risk. Right. But the cost of development is typically a known number, because I get told, right, here's the estimate for this feature. And we break it down into tasks, and testing's a part of the task, and I can look at it and go, that's what that testing is costing me. Do you often experience companies that track the cost of remediation and the cost of bugs, customer satisfaction, coming back the other direction? Or is it more like a guess or marginal accounting?
What I've seen so far is more of a guess,
Okay.
right? Nobody really, or very few people actually goes through the whole, how much does it cost if we don't test it now, to then identify the source of the issue later, where we have to go poke and make changes, validate those changes until we feel confident pushing that forward. Not a lot of people track those costs.
Makes sense. And so would you say that testing is effectively an insurance policy against those bugs in the future?
Yeah, it does help you with that for sure.
Okay.
Right? Because then it goes into the practice as to how do you create those tests? Because there are tools that will allow you, once something is implemented, you can point a tool to it that will automatically create the tests for what's there, right? So it's machine generate tests for machines, essentially. Then those are great, right? You know, those tests definitely help, but there are other practices where not only do you have the tests to make sure that what's there works, but also to actually describe or spec out what is the intended behavior. And if the tests are written in that way, then not just the technologists, but also the business folks can actually read those tests that, again, are not referred to as tests anymore, they're specs. And then those specs will say, well, these are the assumptions, these are the triggers, this is the outcome. Yes, that's exactly what we have discussed as far as the purpose for the feature that we're building, for example.
So back to our jargons and acronyms. Specs sounds like it's short for something.
Specification, right?
Okay.
So
that's the business specification for what you want the behavior to look like.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And so do you have business folks who read and write those with you?
So it's very uncommon because most businesses, they've been taught to write requirements, right? I want this screen to have some, you know, things in there that I can put in some information, and I want it to have a button that when I push, it will put data somewhere, right? So it tells you what, it tells you how, but it does not tell you why we actually want that. Why do we want that behavior, not just from the system's perspective, but from the business, from the end user's perspective? Because oftentimes we hear, well, yeah, here we have the systems, but we also have a people's problem. Well, okay, maybe there's a certain behavior that the people are showing that they're not like performing their tasks the way we would expect them to do. Okay, is there a behavior that we can sort of like either enforce or change or help with through systems? So by writing out specs in that manner, we broadcast that information from the business all the way over to the developer so that they understand, hey, we're not just building a hammer, but this is the greater purpose that we are trying to solve.
That makes sense. And so effectively, if I boil it down, the argument is that testing will reduce the total cost of ownership if we end up in the right space, right? There's too much testing that could actually remove the value that we're generating because we're wasting time.
Yes.
And there's too little, which would cause us to have hidden balloon payments once we're in production for the issues that crop up there, cause us loss of market share, those kind of things.
Correct.
And so we're trying to balance the total cost of ownership against speed to market.
Yes. Yeah. And I absolutely like the way you put it, because it does remind me that like with the whole too much testing, because yes, I can see business like pushing back if developers are spending a lot of time writing tests for features that are low impact to the business. It's like, oh, it's that one feature that, you know, a very tiny % of our, you know, user base actually is using. And it's a feature that, you know, if it doesn't work, if there's a bug, you know, we're maybe one phone call away or one voucher away for, you know, keeping the users happy. So why spend time on that? So oftentimes a tool that developers use is called code coverage. So it's essentially tools that will tell us how much of the code that's written is covered by tests. I personally don't use that tool for the reasons that most people use, which is to make sure that we have tests for everything, right? Instead, I like seeing feature coverage.
Okay.
And then prioritizing that based on how valuable to the business is that feature. And then putting the appropriate levels and types of tests on those features first.
So I'd want to protect the features that generate revenue for me, make sure that I'm efficient with costs,
Yes.
but I wouldn't necessarily want to touch all the features of the system because it might not be cost effective.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And so when we get to a total cost of ownership against speed to development, how much slower and how much more will it cost to develop features with testing as a part of the design versus after the fact? Like what's the incremental cost that I'm talking about?
So by taking the time to have the discussions around creating the specs, the specification for the features, if we do that early on, we are more likely to have the delivery team, the developers, produce the outcome that the business is looking for.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't do that, we leave it up to the development team to figure out, right? And spend a lot of time architecting, designing databases and layers of communication and a lot of the technical stuff to pull something off, put it in front of the business, try it out with the users, and then make it all the way back. And oftentimes it's like, yeah, that's not at all what we need. We're gonna have to change everything,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that there's a lot of cost involved with that. If we instead take that time beforehand to make sure that, hey, the people building the software, they actually understand not only what the software does, how it does the things, but why is it being created to begin with? We're gonna decrease the number of round trips from developers to the business and back.
So something I want to highlight in this is you notice that we talked about round trips. We talked about the total cost of ownership and the cost of rework. But in that cost of rework, if you're not seeing those cycles, then you also get a linear kind of reduction in the cost to take this approach to testing. The approach to testing in closing the understanding gap is directly relational to the size of that understanding gap. Taking this feature-based or early on approach actually isn't very expensive if your business and your developers are tightly aligned.
Yeah.
It is very expensive only when they're different. And so if you're spending a lot of time and money working through putting in feature-based testing and integrating testing early, it's because you were getting it wrong way more often than you were getting it right.
Yes.
And so the fact that it's expensive to implement should maybe be an indicator that we've got a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. This is where I get to refer to my notes because I have my notes here. So I've often heard that we should automate all testing. I hear a lot of absolutes. I mean, a lot of absolutes when it comes to if I talk to an automated tester or an SDET, a software developer, engineer, and test.
That's it.
Got it. I'm learning. They'll tell me everything that can be automated should be automated.
Okay.
That seems wrong. What would you tell me is the right level if you're advocating on my behalf?
The way I see it, and usually my approach to it, because I've worked with many organizations where they have a legacy system created, many years ago, no automated tests whatsoever. And then I give them a class, I coach them on how to write automated tests. So then oftentimes they get bit by the bug. That's like, oh, I need to write tests for everything now, right? No, that's not going to happen. Very costly. Probably the software was not written with testability in mind. So it's very hard to write those automated tests to begin with. So I usually ask the following question to the business folks. I say, think of maybe a couple of features that if those features are not working, if there's bugs or what have you, are you going to be either making money or not making money? You're going to be losing money, right? Focus on those. So make sure that we have those features covered, but also leveraging the other side of it, which is, okay, if that feature is not working, what is the likelihood for it to not work? And if that happens, what is the correction you have to make? Is it something that it can be just like a manual process where you call, the client and you send them a voucher, or is it something like, no, it's very likely to happen because it integrates with other systems that we do not control and we have to account for that. right, and establish practice on that. So that's my go-to technique. It's like make sure that you are covering the things that matter, because it's very easy. Us developers, we like writing code. So many times we write code just because it's like, well, what if this thing happens? What if that thing happens? Without thinking, what is the likelihood of that happening? And then now we're writing tests for those what ifs that may never happen, right? So flipping that around and working together with the business to understand risk assessments, the value. And I mentioned, are you making money or losing money? Well, maybe you're a nonprofit, and the outcome of your system is to help more people through your software. If you're not helping more people, okay, let's protect those features with enough tests to capture that.
It's interesting. I had not thought about the approach to testing and evaluating what we should automate and what we shouldn't as kind of a risk-adjusted kind of capital forecast, right? If I take, here's what my capital needs in the business are going to be, and I go, here are all my risks and the probability of those happening, then I adjust the total risk by the probability, and that gives me kind of what I should set aside in case,
right?
As a reasonable approach. And it sounds like that's roughly what you're doing with testing. Is you're going, let's take our risks, our probabilities, and the impact they'll have, and that's where we spend our time and money.
Yeah, and with that, there's not just the finding bugs in the future and all, but resilience of the business on that. Maybe it's a new feature, right? It could be one of those okay, this is a new feature for a new service that we're offering to the market. We're going to try to put it out as quickly as possible for a select group of users to see how that flies. So we're still making up our minds on that. So it makes no sense to have full code coverage with tests for that feature. Just do the bare minimum to get it out, putting some bits in place so that you can gather the data, create information and insight based on that new feature, and then see, hey, is that going to yield the value that the business wants? If so, all right, let's set aside some budget for the testing. How is this feature going to evolve now that we've learned certain things from this first stab at it?
I like that, because you're effectively taking product metrics and feature flags that allow you to roll back features as a substitute to early effort.
Correct.
You're doing, here's a minimum amount of testing. As the feature becomes more and more popular, more and more critical to the business, you wrap it in more testing. How do you make sure that when it becomes more popular, that additional effort gets rolled into the backlog and the work that the team's budgeted to do, and doesn't get lost into this big amorphous bucket called technical debt?
So that's a very appropriate question. It does depend a lot on the maturity of the team, how the team collaborates together. I've worked on teams where, as we are building a feature, we build this attitude and mentality on the team members that if, for instance, I'm working on a feature and I'm writing the code, as well as I can, given what I know at that point in time. And if there are things that I feel like, you know what, this is technical debt. I know this because, there's more that I could do to it. Sometimes you're going to just tag in code. You're going to drop a note in there saying, hey, there is technical debt here. These are the reasons why it's sitting here. It's because, time to market. We're just trying to roll something out real quick. Sometimes that will suffice. If the team knows, hey, next time we have an enhancement for this story, before we size that, we're going to go to the test, the specs that describe that feature, and look through the code, look for those comments to say, hey, guys, when we did that feature, when we put together that feature 3 months ago, these are the things that we've left in there. If we want to enhance that, make changes to it, let's keep that into account, because okay, is it going to be the time to pay off the technical debt, or do we still want to take in a little more to push something else and then make that decision? So whether we drop some comments in the code, whether we add that to our backlog with user stories to indicate, hey, next time you're working on the mortgage calculator feature, keep an eye on this, right? To have those things always, pop up.
Fantastic. And so testing has traditionally been done after the fact by another team, another phase of the project. And it seems like you're advocating that we change that, and change that significantly across the board. Why? Right? If we've been building the most technological society that we know ever existed on that approach, is it really time to change it?
I believe so, because again, covering this gap between the software, the software developer who's there writing their JavaScript, their Java, their C# code, to the actual users of those systems. Because at the end of the day, we're building systems to automate aspects of people's lives. And by the way, I forgot to give folks this background. I've always worked in business software for real people, right? That's that's been my experience. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you're writing C#, JavaScript, any of that. It means, does the thing that I'm building serve the purpose for which it's being created? Is it making somebody else's life better? Is it making their work more enjoyable, more effective, productive? And if we decrease this gap, we enhance our chances to actually succeed at that. A very typical example that I bring is, well, if we just have your typical requirements and the requirements say, well, on this screen here, maybe it's an employee's screen, it's an HR system, and there's a delete button. This is the requirement. I need a delete button. When you hit that button, that employee goes away. Well, there's a big gap there. Delete is a very technical word, right? It means destroying some data from some persistence layer, like a database, a file on this. It does not match the actual people, right? You're never going to come up to me and say, Claudio, you are deleted, right? You may say, you are fired. I hope you don't do that. You may say, you've been transferred to another branch. There are business terms and activities that get lost when we don't bring that specification to a common ground, as I like saying, where you have both the technical people, the business people, adjusting their jargons, their language, to make sure that everybody's on the same page, right? When somebody says, oh, I need a cancel on that sales order, a cancel button on that sales order screen. But what does that mean? From a user's perspective, from a business perspective, it means canceling the order. Historically, as developers, we put a cancel button to say, well, I've opened the screen, now I want to cancel the screen. Right, so there's a huge mismatch there. When you actually need to cancel a sales order, then what do you call that button?
Okay.
Right, so that's why I personally have been advocating to bring those folks together and have these conversations.
So is the problem solvable that we're trying to solve by shifting testing significantly earlier in the process? Is that solvable by better requirements gathering, better user design?
User design, yes. Better requirements, I don't think so. Only if the people if the requirements tell not just what's being built, how it's being built, but why, right? Give the people who are going to be developing the solution, hence developers, the artifacts so that they can make the best decisions as to how those features are going to surface. And if the language in the requirements is well understood by everybody who's reading that, so there's no room for interpretation. And that's where usually things break down, because since there are no conversations around the requirements, sometimes people say, well, we don't have the time to get people in the room to have those conversations. Maybe the developers will just interpret what those things mean. And oftentimes, we're going to get those wrong.
So that makes sense.
Yeah.
A long time ago, I got told the words in a requirement are often stand-ins for complex maps of things, right? When we talk about internally, the balanced scorecard, those 3 words stand in for 15, 20 different things that are communicated as that construct in 3 words.
Yeah.
The 3 words in a written space without that shared context could be massively misunderstood.
Exactly. And another example that I always bring up in this kind of conversation is, so I've been in the US for 20 years. Every time somebody says, oh, the football game last night was great, the image that immediately comes to my mind
It's football.
It's football,
Football,
the real
not American football.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Right? So it takes time. It's the same thing with like picking up some requirements. You may see words that you recognize, but the first image that comes to mind is not what is in the product owner's mind, right? That's why we have to have that actually conversation to clarify. So if everybody on the team, when they see the written words, they're like, I know exactly what you mean. Perfect. But that's often not the case.
Yeah, especially, and you always impress me in this, especially if you have folks on the team who English is not their first language.
That's exactly right.
Being able to read, present, and internalize concepts across that translation barrier on top of the context barrier is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and it's hard, man. And that's the thing. Like, I've learned to like stop people and say, "Hey, guys, that word that you folks are throwing, I'm seeing everybody nodding. I do not know what that word means." Right? It takes a lot, you know, to just come out and say something like that. And I just know I've worked with a lot of people that they just don't do that. I know that they are not quite grasping everything, but you know, it's like, well, I don't want to ask, but everybody seems to understand what those things mean.
Makes sense. And so what you're describing sounds a lot like the design thinking, user-centric design, a lot of these terms I've been hearing recently. Is that the ultimate end for where testing is going to, is that's the front of a testing process?
I gotta say it's a personal hope of mine, right? Because like in the development process, there's been this issue where maybe the software developers, the coders, are writing a feature for like 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and the QA folks, the testers, they don't see that until the developers say, I'm done. And then they have no idea what the feature is supposed to look like. Well, if we pull that process up so that you can get the testers involved in the process, day one into that work, or even participating in the discussions around the user stories with the UX designers to understand, hey, the real people, this is what is going on in their lives, right? That's extremely important. And this is another example I've been bringing up. It's very easy for us developers to say, oh, our users are not that smart. Look, I created this amazing screen here and they cannot figure it out. Easy for us to say, you know, with our noise canceling headphones, working our standing desk, you know, all cozy, and failing to see that maybe our users are working at a warehouse, or it's like at the forefront with like customers screaming and yelling at them. The less of their worries is going to be, oh, this application looks so pretty, it looks so intuitive, not to them, right? So pulling that and bridging that gap, I think that's where we're going to achieve the user-centric goal.
One of my favorite stories in this space. I used to work for Tyson Foods, and we were working on a user interface for a Sub-Zero freezer, and it was a touchscreen. We thought it was brilliant. You have to take your gloves off for the touchscreen to work. And in a Sub-Zero freezer, that's painful. And so none of the users were using the new interface.
Yeah.
They all clicked the button to go back to the old interface and keyboard and mouse, and we couldn't figure out why until one of us went to the freezer, took the trip, sat down with the users, came back and went, oh, we missed it.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense. So I want to kind of, what's the one thing, if you're talking to business folks like me who don't get testing, don't understand unit testing, integration testing, and all the complexity, what's the one thing that they could walk away and go, that's what I need to go change?
It's a pair.
Okay.
So you said one thing, I was going to say, can I say two? Well, I can say one pair. Communication, collaboration, right? People have to learn to communicate well, right? Which doesn't, oftentimes I hear from developers saying, oh yeah, I need to dumb down my technical language to the business people so that they can understand me. Like, that's not a nice way to put it, right? Because they also have to dumb down their language so that us technical guys can understand. What we need to do is to adjust our speech to make sure that we can find that level where everybody can understand what's going on, right? So communication, oftentimes I hear from business folks saying, hey, I need to interact better with my development team, what language should I learn? Meaning Java, C#. Some are proud that they say, oh, I can write some queries in T-SQL, right? Query language. Like, no. If we are in the US and everybody interacts in the same spoken language here, my answer is English. Good, clean, terse, concise, easily comprehensible English to begin with, right? And then collaboration. Make sure that it's not just putting the words on paper in a requirement or a user story and then let people figure out. Have the conversations, have people speak back to you. If you are the person like writing a user story, let the person relay the user story back to you in their own words, right? Even justifying, like using an improv technique. Yes, because. Yes, we're going to build this feature because. Let that people state what their perceived value of that feature is. And then when you have this collaboration, you might either go like, no, that's not at all what I mean, but I like where you're going with this. Or it's like, no, there is a translation gap here that we need to either change in the communication, in how we start writing our user stories. So that would be the one thing.
I love that.
I wanted to ask this question that I have before we get too far. You guys have mentioned a lot about culture, communication, language. That's all assuming the conversations exist. So this question asks, how do you recommend creating the space for this conversation if no one at my company but me believes testing is valuable? How do I get a seat at the table?
You want to take a swing at this, and then I've got a piece to add, I think.
Sure. So if I got the question right, one approach that I've been really trying to hammer on is building this environment where people don't have to come up to you and say, hey, Claudio, I have a dumb question. I've been correcting people saying, no, you have a question. The dumb, that's on you. You've added that. You have a question. I really hope I can find the answer or have the answer, or go look for the people who might have the answer. Maybe I have to walk up to the product owner. Maybe I have to walk up to the QA person who knows how they're going to be testing that. So building that kind of environment where it's okay to ask questions, right? You don't have to know everything. It's impossible to know everything about the spoken language, the local culture, the business industry, the technologies that you're using. Oh, but this guy has been writing software for 30 years. Okay, but maybe this person has not worked with this kind of tech stack. They are entitled to have questions. So building an environment where it's okay to ask questions and have them answer.
So I think that's spot on. What I will say is you don't need a gold inlay, gilded and embossed invitation. One of the pieces of our guiding principles here at Improving is that greatness is never guaranteed, but is rarely achieved by doing the minimum. Now, that doesn't mean you got to spend a ton of extra time, but it does mean that just one extra step can put you significantly closer to greatness. If you're working in an organization that doesn't value testing, then start approaching it without using the word testing, right? If you're working in an organization that doesn't value agile, don't use the word agile, right? Hey, I'm going to work on this for a couple of weeks and then show you what I've got, and then you might give me some feedback. Doesn't have the word agile in it anywhere, right? Hey, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write some specifications to make sure I understand the feature. Can I review them with you? Now, that doesn't have to be the BA or the product owner. That doesn't have to be your actual end users. But if you start down that way, first day of the sprint, first day of the week, and you work on understanding in depth the specifications for a feature, and you take them back and review them, it will give you amazing insight. Just the exercise of doing it, right? Planning is amazing. The plan is disposable.
Right.
But it'll also start educating the BA, the product owner, whoever that person you're getting requirements from is, on the missing pieces, the gaps, because inevitably they won't have all the answers. Even though they might, I'm going to give that some thought and get back to you, means they're going to go ask questions. That's okay. Let them have that, because it'll start moving the ball down the road. Progress over perfection and just little steps can move huge mountains. And then the last piece I'll add to this is I've never had a doctor ask me if they can wash their hands before surgery. I've never had an attorney ask me if they can notarize something. Like, they tell me what the level of care looks like. And so my whole team doesn't have to do testing. If testing is the way I understand design, I can start. Now, is that a little bit harder of a path? Sure. But ultimately, I have yet to see a team where one person started and everybody didn't end up following over time because they realized it was better. It's that little extra step, and it doesn't have to be everywhere. It doesn't have to be 100% code coverage. Just the big pieces of the story make a big difference.
Yeah.
Culture change comes in slow, excruciating increments.
Yeah. And I love the example that I always bring about, like a doctor, washing their hands. We as the patient, we know that they are doing that for us, right? We've learned that. So with testing, it's the same thing. Back in the day, and I know a lot of developers still do that, when asked by the business, why are you writing tests? The immediate answer is, oh, to make sure that my code works. Well, from the business perspective, it's like,
that's what I hired you for. Why isn't it working without tests?
Right? So that was like my flawed understanding of why I was doing that. I've since shifted that. So James Clear has a good quote that is, the hardest part about solving a problem is to accurately define it, right? So that's why I write specs these days, which is to encode or to describe my understanding of the business. So that I can show to the business. Showing a test, it just makes sure that my code works to the business. They're like, that's all Greek to me. I don't understand. Now, if I show a test that looks like, it uses the business language, like, oh, yeah. Oh, you're getting my business. Thanks you. Thanks for doing that. That mental shift is huge.
Absolutely. One last point on this one is I was reading a note from a friend earlier today, said that I was just told that if we need domain experts, we'll hire them. We're looking for a developer. Like, it's shocking because developers apply technology to solve business problems. They will become domain experts. And often, if you want to go to the deepest domain details of your company, go talk to the people who wrote the systems that operate it, because they have to keep that mental model to be able to change the system. And they become domain experts over time. This is a way to go through and describe those behaviors on the path to becoming that domain expert.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answers the question. Do you have any others, Sherwin?
I do. This one's from a team I think that already embraces testing. Do you have any high-level tips for a team that wants to test to help them begin writing unit tests for a legacy system that has no existing unit tests? Where do you begin?
Yes, there is. I love that question. There is one book must read.
Feathers, right?
Yes, Michael Feathers, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. I've read that book when it first came out in 2004-ish. And I remember that book really resonated with me, that I got a lot out of it, but I hadn't revisited that book in like 18 years. I'm just going through a book club with fellow improvers to go over that book because I'm like, okay, I've been referring that book to people. Let me revisit it to make sure that it aged well. And yes, so by all means, read that book immediately, and do not just read it, put it into practice, because as I'm revisiting the book, I'm saying, oh yeah, that I'm totally doing it. Yes, I've been doing this for almost 2 decades now. Do it. Get the book and be very deliberate. And if you're in a team, do that as a team thing, right? Do it as a book club. Every week, get together, cover one chapter, share with your coworkers how you've been applying that. What are the challenges that you face? Because that's usually the problem. Writing tests for legacy code is just to put some of that those bits under test in a test harness extremely hard. Share that with your coworkers because they may know a thing or two, or you can develop that muscle together.
Absolutely +1 that one. That was the book everybody answered this question with when I was still writing software. And a book to stand the test of time in software for 2 decades and still be the #1 answer. Hands down, could not recommend that book more.
Yep, absolutely.
Got one more for you. If you want to squeeze in this
Absolutely.
question from my type of person. He's an agilist. The Scrum Master is asking, as a Scrum Master, I believe testing is value added. But how do I help my developers start seeing it too? Since I can't jump in and just show them.
That's a great question. The way I've been approaching it, when I do play, oftentimes I do play the Scrum Master role in teams. And then how do I sell the practice to other developers? Well, I'll, for instance, pick up a user story on the board and say, okay, the user story says, in order to achieve some value I want to, and then we flip the card. It's maybe we have some bullet points for the acceptance criteria. I oftentimes pick up that card, walk up to the QA person, the tester, and say, how are you going to be testing this, right? And then the person will say, well, I need to set up a product that has that's available in stock, and I need to set up this and that. So I'm going to, with them, start writing the Gherkin language, the given when thence. Given a product and the product exists in stock, when the user places an order, then an email gets sent out, inventory level. So I will write that with the QA person, right? And then I'm going to work with the developer and say, here, these are your specs, right? If you do outside in development, you can start writing the specs, the tests for this right here, because that's a problem that most developers have. I know I had that in the past. How do you write a test for something that does not exist? Well, start by describing the problem, right? And whatever you're going to be writing, somebody's going to be doing the manual test. That's why I like that collaboration with the QA folks. Say, how are you going to test this? The things you're going to say, that's what's going to drive how I'm going to build that feature. That's one way to tackle the situation.
I like it. My answer in this one is going to be entirely kind of disconnected from the technology. Is humans, I wish we were motivated by benefits and rewards and the things that bring us value. We're not. We like where we're comfortable. Being uncomfortable is uncomfortable. And most of the time we're motivated by the avoidance of pain more so than the pursuit of reward. And so like, when you look at things like interrogation and whatnot, actual pain is only the second greatest motivator. Fear of pain is the #1 motivator. And this sounds like it's going very dark. I promise it's not. What that says, though, is that we need to paint the world we're going to live in without testing in vivid detail. Because I don't know a single person who loves solving the same problems over and over and constantly having the same pain over and over. But we're like the frog that you put into the cold pot of water and then you started heating it up. And we've just gotten used to it. We don't look at it and go, it could be better, because we've done it for 20 years. So if you're that Scrum Master and you're not going to be able to edict, it might be worthwhile to just go, what would the world look like if we didn't have these 5 pains that are caused by lack of testing or a lack of understanding requirements, and then start taking steps to solve them? Because once you've painted the world that you're living in with the pain and without it, most teams will choose to move towards less pain.
Question.
Well, Claudio, thank you. I greatly appreciate the conversation. Thank you for everybody, participating online, and Shervin producing. That's all we've got. Next month, we're going to be back and actually talking about the ubiquitous language that you talked about with domain-driven design.
Yeah.
So greatly appreciate everybody taking some time, and maybe my clicker will work. There we go.
Outstanding.
Thank you all for attending today's Improving Talk, and Devlin and Claudio, thank you for sharing the business case for testing. The recording of this session will be available the next business day. To view the recording, locate the session from Improving's virtual events page, where you can also register for future Improving virtual events. I also want to invite you to sign up for the Improving Edge, our virtual technology conference scheduled for June 6th through the 10th. Register for free at theimprovingedge.com. Have a wonderful weekend, and remember to be kind to each other.